Aristotle stands as one of the most influential figures in Western philosophy, whose intellectual legacy has shaped a vast array of disciplines, including metaphysics, ethics, logic, natural sciences, and politics. His works have not only laid the foundation for much of Western thought but have also continued to influence philosophical inquiry across centuries, from the classical period through to the present. Aristotle's importance in the history of philosophy is immeasurable, as his system of thought addressed a broad spectrum of human experience, exploring the nature of the universe, the mind, morality, and the organization of society. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small town in northern Greece, and grew up in an environment steeped in intellectual rigor. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the Macedonian royal court, which likely exposed Aristotle to a medical and scientific way of thinking from an early age. At the age of 17, Aristotle moved to Athens to study at Plato's academy, marking the beginning of an intellectual relationship that would profoundly shape his philosophical development. Although he spent approximately 20 years in Plato's academy, Aristotle's philosophical trajectory diverged from Plato's in key ways, ultimately developing a system that became distinct from the idealism of his teacher. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle was one of deep intellectual engagement. Aristotle greatly respected Plato and acknowledged his foundational contributions to philosophy, particularly in the areas of metaphysics and ethics. Plato's concept of the theory of forms, which posits that the material world is an imperfect reflection of an ideal, non-material realm, was a central idea at the academy. However, Aristotle was critical of the abstract nature of this theory, believing that it failed to account for the practical and empirical world in which humans live. While Plato emphasized abstract, unchanging truths, Aristotle took a more empirical and practical approach, arguing that knowledge and understanding should be based on the observation of the physical world. This empirical orientation would become a defining characteristic of Aristotle's philosophy. He argued that reality could be understood through the study of natural phenomena, a view that laid the groundwork for modern science. During his time at Plato's academy, Aristotle became exposed to a broad range of philosophical teachings. Plato's idealist framework, however, did not fully satisfy Aristotle, who sought a more systematic and concrete understanding of the world. In contrast to Plato's belief in the separation of the ideal and the material, Aristotle proposed that forms exist within things themselves, not in an external, transcendent realm. This marked a significant philosophical departure from Plato, laying the foundation for Aristotle's subsequent contributions to metaphysics, logic, and natural philosophy. The historical context of ancient Greece during Aristotle's life is crucial in understanding his intellectual development. Greece was at the height of its cultural and political influence during the 4th century BCE, a period marked by the rise of Macedonia under King Philip II. The political landscape of the time was characterized by the decline of the Athenian city-state's dominance, which had been prominent during the earlier part of the century. The establishment of the Macedonian Empire under Philip and his son, Alexander the Great, would have a profound impact on the intellectual environment in which Aristotle worked. During this period, there was a growing interest in the natural world, as well as in questions related to ethics, politics, and human behavior. The Greek intellectual tradition, which had already produced figures like Socrates, Plato, and the pre-Socratics, was evolving, and Aristotle's contributions were a direct response to and extension of these earlier thinkers. Aristotle's later contributions to philosophy and science were groundbreaking and far-reaching. In logic, he developed the syllogism, a form of deductive reasoning that would serve as the foundation of formal logic for centuries. His treatise Organon laid out the principles of logical thinking, offering a systematic approach to reasoning that became a cornerstone of Western intellectual tradition. Aristotle's influence on logic persisted through the Middle Ages, shaping both scholastic philosophy and the development of modern logic. In ethics, Aristotle introduced a theory that focused on virtue and the cultivation of good character. His Nicomachean Ethics remains one of the most important works in Western moral philosophy. Unlike Plato, who emphasized the pursuit of ideal forms, Aristotle argued that the good life is achieved through the development of virtue, which lies in finding the balance between excess and deficiency. This concept, known as the golden mean, provided a framework for understanding moral behavior that remains relevant to this day. Aristotle's view of ethics emphasized practical wisdom, phronesis, and the idea that moral excellence is achieved through habituation and rational action, rather than through contemplation of abstract ideals. Aristotle's metaphysical theories also had a profound impact on Western philosophy. In contrast to Plato's emphasis on the transcendent world of forms, Aristotle focused on the material world and the concept of substance. He posited that everything in the world is composed of both form and matter, with form being the essential nature of a thing and matter being the substance in which form is realized. Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, an eternal and necessary being that causes motion without being moved itself, became a foundational idea in the development of later metaphysical thought. In the realm of natural science, Aristotle's empirical approach to studying biology, physics, and other natural phenomena set the stage for the future development of scientific inquiry. His systematic observations in biology, particularly his studies of animal life, helped lay the groundwork for the classification of living organisms. While some of his conclusions were later proven to be incorrect, Aristotle's scientific methodology was revolutionary for its time. He introduced the idea that knowledge could be derived from observation and experience, an approach that would become a cornerstone of the scientific method in the modern era. Aristotle's contributions spanned a remarkable range of disciplines, from logic and metaphysics to ethics, politics, and natural science. His influence on Western thought has been profound, shaping not only philosophical inquiry but also scientific exploration, political theory, and ethical reasoning. His relationship with Plato was pivotal in the development of his own ideas, but his intellectual journey ultimately led him to break from Plato's teachings and establish his own philosophical system, one grounded in empirical observation and practical reasoning. Aristotle's legacy endures, continuing to shape the ways in which we understand the world and our place within it. Aristotle, one of the most prominent figures in Western philosophy, was born in 384 BCE in the small town of Stagira, located in northern Greece. His birth in this modest yet strategically important location marked the beginning of a life that would ultimately shape the course of philosophy, science, and thought for centuries to come. Stagira was a Greek colony, a factor that contributed to Aristotle's early exposure to both local and wider Greek cultural influences. This environment, rich in intellectual exchange, was the ideal setting for the growth of a young mind destined to alter the course of human knowledge. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was a physician who served at the court of King Amyntas of Macedon, the father of Philip II. The influence of his father's medical background and his position in the Macedonian royal court would play a significant role in Aristotle's later approach to scientific observation. As a child, Aristotle was likely exposed to the practical application of medicine, observation, and empirical knowledge, which would become central to his philosophical methodology. In addition to his father's influence, Aristotle would have been exposed to the rich traditions of Greek intellectual thought that permeated the cultural landscape of the time. Stagira was an important center of learning, and while it was not as renowned as Athens, it provided Aristotle with early intellectual exposure. Though Aristotle's early life in Stagira would have been one of relative tranquility, the events of his later life would place his hometown in the context of the broader Greek world. At a young age, Aristotle experienced the upheavals of Greek politics and culture, as the Greek city-states were embroiled in a constant struggle for power, with the rise of Macedonia under King Philip II signaling a shift in the balance of power across the region. While his father's work exposed him to the royal world of Macedon, young Aristotle's mind was being shaped by his immediate surroundings, an environment in which learning and intellectual pursuit were valued. When Aristotle was around 17 years old, his life took a decisive turn. Following his father's death, Aristotle traveled to Athens, where he would begin what was to become the most significant period of his intellectual development: his enrollment at Plato's Academy. The Academy, founded by Plato around 387 BCE, was the foremost educational institution in Athens, attracting young scholars from across the Greek world. It was here, in the heart of Greek philosophy, that Aristotle would study for nearly 20 years and lay the groundwork for his own ideas. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated, for it was at the Academy that Aristotle was introduced to the ideas of Plato, whose influence would permeate much of Aristotle's early thinking, even though Aristotle would ultimately diverge from Plato's teachings in critical ways. Plato's Academy was a hub of intellectual activity, and its teachings centered on the pursuit of wisdom, the nature of reality, and the role of the philosopher in society. Plato himself, having been profoundly influenced by his teacher Socrates, focused on abstract ideas, most notably the theory of forms. Plato's emphasis was on understanding the nature of ideal, eternal forms, which he believed existed beyond the physical world and represented the true essence of all things. His focus on metaphysical ideals was paired with a commitment to the pursuit of knowledge through reason, rather than empirical observation. Plato's influence on his students, including Aristotle, was profound, and Aristotle's early exposure to these ideas would shape the trajectory of his own philosophical development. Although Aristotle was undoubtedly influenced by Plato, he was not a passive student. While Plato's philosophy emphasized the immaterial world of forms, Aristotle took a markedly different approach. He believed that knowledge could be gained through empirical observation and analysis of the natural world, which he would later develop into a hallmark of his own philosophical method. At the Academy, Aristotle was exposed to Plato's dialectical method, which involved the use of dialogue and logical argument to explore philosophical issues. Though he would ultimately reject some of Plato's metaphysical doctrines, the experience of studying under Plato profoundly influenced Aristotle's intellectual formation, particularly in his early philosophical investigations. Aristotle's time at the Academy was formative not only because of his exposure to Plato's teachings but also because it provided him with the opportunity to engage with some of the most brilliant minds of the era. The intellectual environment at the Academy was rich, and Aristotle would have interacted with other prominent philosophers and students of the time. This environment, which fostered rigorous debate and intellectual exchange, would have been crucial in developing Aristotle's critical thinking and sharpening his philosophical skills. The Academy became more than just a place of learning for Aristotle, it became a crucible for the formation of his intellectual identity. In addition to his studies in philosophy, Aristotle's time in Athens would have exposed him to the vibrant political and cultural life of the city. Athens was at the peak of its intellectual and artistic achievements during this period, and Aristotle would have had access to the works of playwrights, historians, and other philosophers who were part of the Athenian cultural milieu. It was in this environment that Aristotle honed his understanding of human nature, ethics, and politics, an understanding that would later inform his own works in ethics and political philosophy. His exposure to the political debates of the time, including the tensions between Athenian democracy and other forms of government, likely shaped his views on the role of the state and the nature of political life. While Aristotle's time at Plato's Academy was undoubtedly transformative, it also marked a period of intellectual evolution that would eventually lead him to question some of Plato's fundamental ideas. As Aristotle matured intellectually, he began to find Plato's theory of forms increasingly unsatisfactory. According to Plato, the material world was merely a shadow of the true, ideal forms, and knowledge of the forms could only be attained through philosophical contemplation, rather than sensory experience. Aristotle, however, was not content with this abstraction. He argued that the forms did not exist independently of the physical world, and that true knowledge could only be obtained through the observation and study of the natural world. This break from Plato's idealism would become a defining feature of Aristotle's own philosophical system. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, Aristotle left Athens and spent several years traveling in Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands. His time away from Athens was marked by a series of intellectual and personal developments that would contribute to his eventual return to Athens, where he would establish his own school, the Lyceum. However, before leaving Athens, Aristotle's time at Plato's Academy had already provided him with a firm foundation in philosophy, an understanding of the key philosophical questions of his time, and the intellectual tools necessary for his future philosophical endeavors. Aristotle's early education and influences were instrumental in shaping his intellectual journey. His early exposure to his father's medical knowledge, his studies in Stagira, and his time at Plato's Academy all contributed to the development of a mind that would eventually seek to understand the natural world through empirical observation and rational analysis. Although Aristotle's time at the Academy was marked by his engagement with Plato's teachings, it was also a period of critical intellectual growth. The influence of Plato on Aristotle cannot be underestimated, but it was Aristotle's eventual break from Plato's idealism that would set the stage for the development of his own philosophical system, a system that would challenge, refine, and build upon the ideas of his teacher. Ultimately, Aristotle's early life and education were not merely a precursor to his later achievements. They were the foundation upon which the entire edifice of his philosophy would be built. Aristotle's time at Plato's Academy, from the age of 17 to about 37, represents a critical period in his intellectual development and provides the backdrop for many of the philosophical debates that would shape his own later works. In 367 BCE, Aristotle made the journey from his hometown of Stagira to Athens, the intellectual and cultural heart of Greece. Athens was a vibrant center of philosophy, politics, and art, and it was at the Academy, Plato's renowned philosophical school, that Aristotle would spend 2 decades of his life, deeply immersed in the study of philosophy. This formative period not only exposed Aristotle to the teachings of Plato but also gave him the intellectual tools to critique, adapt, and eventually surpass those teachings in some key areas. Plato's academy was more than just an educational institution. It was a place of philosophical inquiry and dialectical method. Plato founded the academy around 387 BCE as a school devoted to the pursuit of truth and wisdom through reason and discussion. The academy quickly became the premier philosophical institution of Athens, attracting students from all over the Greek world. It focused on a range of philosophical disciplines, from metaphysics and ethics to epistemology and political theory. The central philosophical concern of the academy was the nature of reality, with Plato himself being heavily influenced by the teachings of his teacher Socrates, and his philosophical system centered on the theory of forms. For Plato, the material world was not the true reality. Rather, the forms represented a higher, unchanging reality that transcended the physical world. The academy was not only a school for philosophy but also a place for the cultivation of the soul, with the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom seen as the ultimate purpose of human life. As a young man, Aristotle entered this intellectual world and became a student of Plato. For the next 2 decades, Aristotle would engage with the ideas of Plato and his fellow scholars. This period was critical in shaping his own philosophical outlook, and it was here that Aristotle encountered some of the central ideas that would define his later critiques and innovations. Plato's influence on Aristotle was profound, and yet the two philosophers would eventually diverge on several important points, especially regarding metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. The philosophical relationship between Plato and Aristotle, marked by both deep admiration and intellectual disagreement, is one of the most significant in the history of philosophy. The relationship between Aristotle and Plato was complex. Aristotle deeply respected Plato, both as a teacher and as a philosopher, but he was not a mere follower of Plato's doctrines. While Plato was the intellectual giant of the academy, Aristotle's intellectual journey was marked by his growing dissatisfaction with several of Plato's ideas. Plato's metaphysical and epistemological views, particularly his theory of forms, would later be the subject of Aristotle's most significant criticisms. Yet, during his years at the academy, Aristotle absorbed much from Plato, including the dialectical method, the emphasis on reason, and the pursuit of philosophical wisdom. One of the key areas in which Aristotle's views differed from Plato's was in the realm of metaphysics. Plato's theory of forms posited that the material world was a mere shadow or imitation of a higher, unchanging reality composed of ideal forms. For Plato, the forms represented perfect and eternal concepts that could not be found in the physical world, which was seen as imperfect and transitory. This view of the world led Plato to argue that true knowledge could only be attained through the contemplation of these eternal forms, and that the physical world was an imperfect reflection of these unchanging realities. Plato's metaphysics was therefore a dualistic system, dividing reality into 2 distinct realms, the realm of the forms and the material world. Aristotle, however, rejected this dualism. For him, the material world was not an imperfect reflection of a higher reality but the very place where reality could be understood. Aristotle's metaphysical system was rooted in the idea of substance, which he defined as that which has independent existence. Unlike Plato, who separated the material world from the realm of the forms, Aristotle argued that forms existed within particular things themselves. For Aristotle, the nature of reality was rooted in the material world, and knowledge was to be derived from observing and understanding the natural world. This marked a profound departure from Plato's idealism, as Aristotle sought to ground knowledge in empirical observation rather than abstract, transcendent concepts. Another major area of intellectual engagement for Aristotle at Plato's academy was ethics. Plato's ethics, as articulated in works like the Republic, was centered on the idea of achieving the good life by contemplating and aligning oneself with the eternal forms. The philosopher king, as Plato envisioned in his ideal society, was a ruler who possessed knowledge of the forms and could guide the city-state toward justice and virtue. For Plato, the key to moral life was aligning one's soul with the perfect forms, particularly the form of the good. This ethical system was intellectual in nature, emphasizing knowledge and rational contemplation as the path to virtue. Aristotle, however, took a more practical approach to ethics. In his seminal work Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle developed his theory of virtue ethics, which focused on the cultivation of good character and the achievement of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. Unlike Plato, who placed abstract forms at the center of his ethical system, Aristotle argued that virtue lies in finding the balance between excess and deficiency. This balance, or golden mean, applies to all aspects of human behavior, from courage to generosity to temperance. Aristotle's ethics were grounded in the practical realities of human life, emphasizing the importance of habituation and practical wisdom, phronesis, in the development of virtue. Aristotle believed that individuals could achieve moral excellence through the development of good habits, and that living a virtuous life required a focus on real-world actions, not merely theoretical ideals. Plato's influence on Aristotle was also evident in their shared interest in political philosophy. Plato's Republic was a vision of an ideal city-state governed by philosopher-kings, where justice would prevail through the rule of the wise. Plato's political system was built upon his metaphysical ideas, where the philosopher, by virtue of understanding the forms, would be the most qualified to rule justly. Aristotle, however, rejected Plato's idealism and instead focused on the practical realities of governance. In his Politics, Aristotle argued that the best form of government was one that took into account the nature of the people and the practical circumstances of the city-state. Aristotle's political theory was more empirical than Plato's, as he studied and analyzed various forms of government, such as monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, to determine which could best promote the common good. While Plato sought a perfect society governed by philosopher-kings, Aristotle recognized that such a system was impractical and instead proposed a more pragmatic approach to politics based on empirical observation of existing political systems. In addition to ethics and politics, Aristotle's time at Plato's Academy exposed him to a broad range of other philosophical topics. These included epistemology, the study of knowledge, aesthetics, the study of beauty and art, and dialectics, the art of reasoning and argumentation. Plato's Academy was a fertile ground for intellectual exchange, and Aristotle's engagement with these subjects laid the foundation for his later contributions to each of these areas. Although Aristotle would develop his own distinctive views on these subjects, much of his intellectual development during this period was influenced by his study of Plato's works and the discussions that took place at the Academy. Aristotle's critique of Plato's theory of forms is perhaps one of the most well-known aspects of their philosophical relationship. While Plato posited that the material world was an imperfect copy of a higher, ideal realm of forms, Aristotle argued that forms existed within the objects themselves, not as separate entities. Aristotle believed that the form of a thing was inseparable from the thing itself and that understanding reality required examining the nature of the object in question. This rejection of Plato's dualism marked a fundamental shift in the way Aristotle would approach metaphysics and knowledge, and it had lasting implications for the development of Western thought. The intellectual environment of Athens in the 4th century BCE was marked by vigorous philosophical debate, and Plato's Academy was at the center of this intellectual activity. The city of Athens was still reeling from the effects of the Peloponnesian War, which had devastated the Athenian Empire, and the political landscape was characterized by instability and shifting allegiances. Despite these challenges, Athens remained a center of intellectual and artistic creativity, with philosophers, poets, and playwrights contributing to a rich cultural milieu. Aristotle's time in Athens exposed him to this dynamic environment, and his intellectual growth was deeply shaped by the ideas and debates of his contemporaries. Plato's influence on Aristotle during this period was significant, but it was also marked by divergence. While Aristotle admired Plato's intellectual rigor and embraced many aspects of his teachings, he ultimately broke away from Plato's idealism and developed a more empirical and practical approach to philosophy. This intellectual maturation was a result of his time at the Academy, where he was exposed to the dialectical method, the pursuit of wisdom, and the rigorous analysis of the world around him. Although Aristotle's views would evolve over time, his years at Plato's Academy provided him with the foundational knowledge and intellectual tools that would allow him to create his own philosophical system, one that would leave an indelible mark on the history of Western thought. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, Aristotle's time at the Academy came to an end. Although he had spent 2 decades in Athens, absorbing and critiquing Plato's teachings, Aristotle's intellectual journey was far from over. With the passing of his beloved teacher, Aristotle found himself at a crossroads, both in his personal life and in his intellectual development. He left Athens, though it is unclear exactly when or why he decided to leave. There are suggestions that the political climate in Athens, which was not always hospitable to philosophers who held views contrary to prevailing political ideologies, might have influenced his departure. Regardless of the precise reasons for his departure, this marked the beginning of a period of travel and independent study that would profoundly shape his future work. Aristotle's first stop after leaving Athens was in Asia Minor, a region that was culturally and intellectually vibrant. Here he spent time in the court of Hermias, a ruler of the city of Assos and the surrounding area in Asia Minor. Hermias had been a student of Plato, and he invited Aristotle to become his personal advisor. The relationship between Aristotle and Hermias was significant, not only because it provided Aristotle with an opportunity to immerse himself in the intellectual environment of Asia Minor but also because it marked a period of deep philosophical reflection and independence for Aristotle. His time at Hermias's court allowed him to refine his thoughts on many philosophical topics, including ethics, metaphysics, and politics. It was here that Aristotle's ideas began to take on a more systematic form, diverging from Plato's idealism and embracing a more empirical, observational approach to understanding the world. During his time at the court of Hermias, Aristotle had the opportunity to study and engage with many intellectuals and thinkers, many of whom shared his interest in philosophy, science, and natural phenomena. This period of intellectual exchange played an important role in shaping Aristotle's thoughts on the natural world, particularly his ideas about biology and the study of living organisms. Aristotle's observations during this time would later inform his groundbreaking work in biology, where he became one of the first philosophers to systematically study and classify animals and plants based on their characteristics. This focus on the natural world marked a sharp departure from Plato's idealism, which emphasized abstract concepts and forms rather than empirical observation. It was during his travels in Asia Minor and the subsequent time he spent in Assos and Lesbos that Aristotle began to develop his distinctive approach to the study of nature, which would later become central to his philosophy. In Assos and Lesbos, Aristotle engaged in extensive studies of marine life, anatomy, and biology. He observed the behaviors of different species, carefully noting their characteristics, movements, and physiological features. This empirical, observation-based approach to studying nature was revolutionary for its time, and it laid the foundation for Aristotle's later works in biology. He categorized animals and plants based on their observable traits, creating an early form of classification that would influence generations of scientists. Aristotle's time in Asia Minor also allowed him to further develop his ideas about the natural world in a way that was independent of the more abstract metaphysical concerns of Plato's philosophy. For Aristotle, understanding the physical world was not about contemplating ideal forms or abstract concepts but rather about careful observation, systematic study, and logical classification. His experiences in Assos and Lesbos were instrumental in shaping his ideas about the natural sciences, which would later lead to him being regarded as one of the founding figures of biology and natural history. While Aristotle's studies in the natural world were a significant part of his time in Asia Minor, it was also a period of personal and philosophical growth. He wrote many works during this time, some of which have been lost to history, but others that have survived give us a glimpse into his evolving thoughts on ethics, politics, and metaphysics. It was during these years that Aristotle's break with Plato's philosophy deepened. Whereas Plato had emphasized the importance of abstract, transcendent forms, Aristotle became increasingly focused on the concrete, empirical world. He believed that true knowledge could only be gained through direct experience and observation of the physical world. This shift in perspective was a turning point in Aristotle's intellectual development, as he began to establish his own philosophical system that was based on the study of the natural world and the pursuit of practical knowledge. After spending several years in Asia Minor, Aristotle's next major step was his return to Macedonia, where he became connected with the royal court of King Philip II. This was another important chapter in Aristotle's life, as it marked his transition from a wandering philosopher to a prominent figure in the royal court. In Macedonia, Aristotle became the tutor of Alexander the Great, the young prince who would go on to become one of the most famous military leaders in history. Aristotle's relationship with Alexander was pivotal, not only for Aristotle's personal life but also for the development of his ideas. The philosophical education he provided to Alexander was deeply influential, and it is said that the young prince's exposure to Aristotle's teachings played a role in shaping his worldview and leadership style. During his time in Macedonia, Aristotle continued his studies and further refined his philosophical ideas. He spent time teaching Alexander, providing him with an education in subjects ranging from philosophy and ethics to science and politics. Aristotle's influence on Alexander is often discussed in the context of the famous leader's later conquests, with some scholars suggesting that Aristotle's teachings helped shape Alexander's sense of destiny and his vision of empire. Although Alexander's military campaigns were driven by a desire for conquest and power, his exposure to Aristotle's ideas may have influenced his views on governance, ethics, and the role of the philosopher in political life. Aristotle's connection with the royal court of Macedonia was not only a significant personal development but also a key moment in his intellectual evolution. His time with Alexander allowed him to engage with the political and military realities of the world, and it gave him an opportunity to consider the practical applications of his philosophical ideas. It was also during this time that Aristotle began to develop some of his most important works, particularly in the fields of ethics, politics, and natural science. His experiences with the royal court of Macedonia deepened his understanding of human nature and the role of the philosopher in shaping society. It was here that Aristotle began to formulate his ideas about the ideal state and the best forms of government, ideas that would later become central to his politics and other works. Aristotle's time in Macedonia was also marked by personal reflection and philosophical writing. While in the service of King Philip, Aristotle had access to the royal library and was able to continue his studies in a variety of fields, including biology, ethics, and metaphysics. During this period he likely began to write some of his most famous works, including the Nicomachean Ethics and the Metaphysics, though these works were not published until later. His time in Macedonia was also when Aristotle began to develop his systematic approach to the study of knowledge, laying the groundwork for his later contributions to logic, ethics, and science. The practical experiences he gained in the royal court, combined with his philosophical background, enabled him to blend theory with practice in a way that was unique among his contemporaries. After several years in Macedonia, Aristotle eventually returned to Athens, where he established his own school, the Lyceum. However, his travels and independent studies in Asia Minor and Macedonia had already provided him with a wealth of experiences and intellectual material that would shape his later works. His time with Hermias, his studies of biology in Assos and Lesbos, and his connection to the royal court of Macedonia all played crucial roles in the development of his philosophy, particularly in his ideas about the natural world, ethics, and politics. It was during these years that Aristotle's thoughts began to take shape into the comprehensive system that would come to define his intellectual legacy. The travels and independent studies that Aristotle embarked upon after leaving Plato's academy were pivotal in shaping his philosophical trajectory. His time in Asia Minor and Macedonia allowed him to refine his ideas, particularly in the natural sciences, ethics, and politics. These years of exploration, intellectual exchange, and personal growth helped him develop the empirical approach to philosophy that became his hallmark. Whether in Assos studying marine life, teaching Alexander the Great in Macedonia, or reflecting on the nature of the cosmos, Aristotle's journey was one of continuous intellectual evolution, preparing him for the monumental contributions he would later make to philosophy, science, and human knowledge. Aristotle's time in the Macedonian court, particularly his role as tutor to the young Prince Alexander, was a crucial period in both his life and intellectual development. His relationship with King Philip II and his involvement in Alexander's education had a lasting impact on the history of philosophy and science. This chapter in Aristotle's life provided him with a unique opportunity to interact with royalty and to shape the intellectual development of one of the most famous military leaders in history. Aristotle's appointment as the tutor to Alexander the Great was a significant moment in both his life and the life of the young prince. Alexander, born in 356 BCE, was the son of King Philip II of Macedon, who sought to provide his son with the best possible education. Recognizing Aristotle's intellectual brilliance and his deep knowledge of philosophy and the sciences, King Philip entrusted the education of his son to him. It was an arrangement that allowed Aristotle to mold Alexander's mind at a critical period in the prince's life. Alexander was around 13 years old when he began his education under Aristotle, a time when young minds are particularly impressionable, and the ideas he encountered during these formative years would shape the way he would later view the world, politics, and leadership. Aristotle's influence on Alexander was profound, and it extended well beyond traditional subjects of study such as literature, rhetoric, and philosophy. Under Aristotle's tutelage, Alexander was exposed to a broad range of ideas that spanned across various fields, from ethics and politics to biology and geography. Aristotle's teachings on governance likely left a lasting impression on the young prince, who would later conquer much of the known world and establish one of the largest empires in history. Aristotle was a firm believer in the concept of the best state, one that balanced elements of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. While Alexander's reign did not perfectly align with these ideas, Aristotle's teachings likely influenced the way he approached leadership and the management of his empire. Aristotle emphasized the importance of virtue and the role of reason in governance, and these ideas may have shaped Alexander's understanding of leadership, even if his actions as a ruler did not always reflect them. In addition to governance, Aristotle also exposed Alexander to the study of culture and science. Alexander's military campaigns took him to far-flung parts of the world, from Egypt to India, and Aristotle's teachings on geography, biology, and culture were likely instrumental in shaping Alexander's worldview. Aristotle's interest in natural history, particularly his studies of biology, zoology, and plant life, might have influenced Alexander's curiosity about the regions he encountered during his conquests. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation and the systematic study of the natural world would have been particularly relevant to Alexander as he traversed different lands and encountered unfamiliar peoples, cultures, and ecosystems. In terms of philosophy, Aristotle's ideas on ethics and virtue would have had a significant impact on Alexander's approach to leadership and his personal behavior. Aristotle believed that the ultimate goal of human life was to achieve eudaimonia, or flourishing, which was achieved through the cultivation of virtue and the exercise of reason. For Aristotle, virtues such as courage, wisdom, and justice were essential to the well-being of both the individual and society. While it is unclear how closely Alexander adhered to these ideas throughout his life, Aristotle's ethical teachings likely shaped his early sense of duty, responsibility, and the role of a ruler in promoting the welfare of his people. The relationship between Aristotle and King Philip II of Macedon, while not as well documented as Aristotle's role as Alexander's tutor, was also of great importance. King Philip, a successful military leader who united the Greek city-states and laid the foundation for the Macedonian Empire, was a pragmatic ruler. His decision to appoint Aristotle as tutor to his son demonstrates a keen awareness of the value of education in shaping future leaders. Although Aristotle and King Philip likely had different approaches to politics, Aristotle being more focused on philosophy and governance, while Philip was a pragmatic king engaged in military conquest, their relationship was likely based on mutual respect. Philip's decision to seek Aristotle's expertise in educating Alexander suggests that the king valued Aristotle's intellectual capabilities and recognized the importance of a well-rounded education for his son. Aristotle, in turn, likely gained insights into the political and military realities of ruling an empire by observing Philip's strategies. Philip's success in uniting the Greek states and his military campaigns would have been an invaluable case study for Aristotle, who was keenly interested in politics, governance, and the role of the state. Although Aristotle's own political philosophy emphasized the role of virtue and reason in governance, his time in the Macedonian court may have given him a more practical understanding of statecraft, warfare, and leadership. While Aristotle's philosophical development during this period is difficult to trace with precision, it is clear that his time in the Macedonian court influenced his thinking in profound ways. The experience of tutoring Alexander allowed Aristotle to engage with real-world political and military affairs, and this practical experience likely deepened his understanding of political philosophy. Aristotle had always been concerned with the relationship between ethics and politics, and his time in the royal court may have led him to refine his views on the nature of power, leadership, and the role of the ruler. His teachings on the ideal state, as outlined in works like Politics, reflect a concern with the organization of society and the role of reason and virtue in the governance of the state. Aristotle's views on monarchy, democracy, and oligarchy were informed by his experiences in the Macedonian court, where he had the opportunity to observe firsthand the workings of royal power and the complexities of political life. In addition to his philosophical work, Aristotle's exposure to the Macedonian court may have influenced his views on the sciences and the study of the natural world. As a tutor to Alexander, Aristotle had access to the resources of the royal court, including the library and the opportunity to gather information from Alexander's military campaigns. These resources likely contributed to Aristotle's growing interest in the natural sciences, particularly biology and zoology. Alexander's travels to distant lands provided Aristotle with an unprecedented opportunity to gather data on the natural world, and the two may have exchanged information on the flora and fauna of the regions Alexander encountered during his conquests. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation and systematic classification was informed, in part, by the knowledge and experiences he gained during this period. Aristotle's time in the Macedonian court also served as a bridge between his earlier philosophical training under Plato and his later development of his own unique philosophical system. While he had been heavily influenced by Plato's ideas, especially in his early years, his experiences in Macedonia helped him move away from Plato's idealism and develop a more empirical and practical approach to philosophy. His time in the royal court of Macedonia allowed him to engage with the real world in a way that Plato's academy had not, and this experience likely influenced his subsequent work in metaphysics, ethics, and natural science. Ultimately, Aristotle's time in the Macedonian court was a defining period in his life. His relationship with Alexander the Great and King Philip II provided him with a wealth of experiences that helped shape his philosophical ideas and gave him a unique perspective on governance, science, and leadership. Through his tutelage of Alexander, Aristotle had the opportunity to influence the thinking of one of history's greatest conquerors, and in turn he learned valuable lessons about the intersection of philosophy and power. His time with the Macedonian royalty marked a crucial phase in his intellectual development and laid the groundwork for the comprehensive philosophical system he would later develop. After years of travel, study, and involvement with the Macedonian court, Aristotle returned to Athens in 336 BCE, making a decisive move to establish his own philosophical school, the Lyceum. This was a crucial turning point in his intellectual journey, marking the beginning of his most productive and influential period. The founding of the Lyceum represented the culmination of Aristotle's philosophical development and his desire to create an institution where his ideas could be explored, developed, and transmitted to future generations. This period would see the production of some of his most important works and the establishment of a distinctive philosophical methodology that would come to be known as the Peripatetic school. Aristotle's decision to return to Athens and found the Lyceum was motivated by several factors. First, Athens was the intellectual heart of the Greek world, a city that had long been home to great philosophers and thinkers. Though he had spent many years in the city as a student of Plato and a teacher of Alexander the Great, Aristotle had not yet had the opportunity to establish his own school in Athens. The time was now ripe for him to return and pursue this goal. His return also coincided with a period of significant political change in Athens. The city was no longer the center of the classical Greek world as it had been in the 5th century BCE, but it was still a place of intellectual vibrancy. By establishing the Lyceum, Aristotle sought to create a lasting intellectual institution that would contribute to the ongoing development of philosophy, science, and politics. The Lyceum was not just a school in the conventional sense. It was a center of intellectual activity where students and scholars could engage in rigorous study and debate. The philosophical and academic goals of the Lyceum were expansive and ambitious. Aristotle sought to create an environment in which philosophy could be studied in a systematic, empirical, and interdisciplinary way. He envisioned the Lyceum as a place where knowledge was not divided into discrete categories but was instead approached in a holistic manner. The school would be a center for the study of ethics, metaphysics, natural science, politics, logic, and many other fields, with an emphasis on empirical observation, rational analysis, and the integration of different branches of knowledge. The structure of the Lyceum was designed to facilitate this wide-ranging approach to learning. Unlike Plato's academy, which had a more formal and structured curriculum focused primarily on philosophical inquiry and abstract thinking, the Lyceum was more dynamic and practical. It was located in a covered walkway, known as the Peripatos, in the city of Athens, and it took its name from this feature. The Peripatetic school, as it became known, was characterized by its emphasis on walking and conversing as a method of teaching. This informal, interactive style of learning was a key feature of Aristotle's pedagogy and set the Lyceum apart from other educational institutions of the time. Aristotle believed that philosophy was best learned through dialogue, discussion, and the exchange of ideas. The peripatetic method encouraged students to think critically, ask questions, and develop their own understanding of the world. The Lyceum was also distinguished by its commitment to empirical research. Aristotle's interest in the natural world, especially in biology and zoology, found a place of prominence at the Lyceum. He and his students conducted extensive observations of the natural world, studying animals, plants, and the physical phenomena of the world around them. This empirical approach was a departure from the idealism of Plato, who had focused on abstract, transcendent forms. Aristotle believed that true knowledge could only be derived from careful observation of the physical world and its processes. The Lyceum became a center for this kind of research, and Aristotle's scientific studies during this time were groundbreaking. He classified animals, studied their behavior, and sought to understand the principles that govern the natural world. This work in biology, along with his contributions to other sciences, marked a major departure from the philosophical traditions of his time and laid the foundation for later developments in the natural sciences. The development of the peripatetic school was closely tied to Aristotle's teachings and methodology. The term peripatetic comes from the Greek word peripatein, meaning to walk about, reflecting the practice of teaching while walking with students in the portico of the Lyceum. This mode of instruction embodied Aristotle's belief in the importance of active engagement with ideas, as opposed to passive learning. The peripatetic school was characterized by its emphasis on logic, ethics, and the natural sciences, and it attracted students from all over the Greek world. Aristotle's followers, known as the peripatetics, engaged in a broad range of intellectual activities, including the study of philosophy, politics, biology, and ethics. They not only absorbed Aristotle's teachings but also sought to expand upon them, contributing to the development of Aristotle's ideas in ways that would influence generations of thinkers. Aristotle's academic and scholarly approach at the Lyceum was characterized by a systematic, comprehensive, and interdisciplinary methodology. He believed that knowledge should be organized into categories, with each category being studied in relation to the others. For Aristotle, philosophy was not a fragmented discipline but rather a unified system in which different branches of knowledge were interconnected. He saw ethics, politics, metaphysics, and natural science as part of a larger whole, with each contributing to a broader understanding of the world. At the Lyceum, Aristotle's approach to teaching was holistic, and he encouraged his students to engage with ideas from a variety of disciplines. This interdisciplinary approach became one of the hallmarks of the peripatetic school and set it apart from other philosophical traditions. Some of Aristotle's most important works were produced during his time at the Lyceum. These works, which would go on to have a profound impact on the development of Western philosophy, include the Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, and Metaphysics. The Nicomachean Ethics is one of Aristotle's most famous and influential works, in which he explores the nature of virtue and the concept of the good life. Aristotle's ethical philosophy is grounded in the idea of eudaimonia, or flourishing, which is achieved through the cultivation of virtue and the exercise of reason. In this work, Aristotle argues that virtue is a mean between extremes, and he offers a detailed analysis of the virtues and their role in achieving a well-lived life. In politics, Aristotle examines the nature of the state and the different forms of government. He compares and contrasts various political systems, including democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, and argues that the best form of government is one that balances the interests of different social classes. Aristotle's political philosophy is deeply connected to his ethical views, as he believes that the purpose of the state is to promote the good life for its citizens. His ideas about politics and governance would influence political thought for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for later developments in political theory and practice. The Metaphysics is perhaps Aristotle's most ambitious and comprehensive work, in which he explores the fundamental nature of reality. In this work he addresses questions about existence, substance, causality, and the nature of being. Aristotle's metaphysical views are grounded in his belief in the importance of empirical observation and the study of the physical world. He argues that reality is composed of substances, each of which has a particular essence or nature. His theory of causality, which distinguishes between four types of causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, became a central aspect of his philosophy and would influence later developments in metaphysics and science. Aristotle's time at the Lyceum was a period of great intellectual achievement and productivity. It was during this time that he produced some of his most important and enduring works, and it was here that his philosophical methodology was fully developed. The Lyceum became a center for intellectual exchange, research, and teaching, and it played a key role in the development of Western philosophy. Aristotle's academic approach, which combined empirical observation with rational analysis, was groundbreaking for its time and set the stage for future developments in science, ethics, and politics. The Lyceum, with its emphasis on interdisciplinary study and its commitment to systematic inquiry, became one of the most influential philosophical schools in history, and its impact continues to be felt in contemporary thought. Aristotle's philosophical contributions are vast and span numerous areas of human thought, from logic and metaphysics to ethics, politics, natural sciences, and rhetoric. His work laid the foundations for many modern disciplines, shaping Western philosophy and providing the intellectual tools for centuries of scientific and philosophical inquiry. The depth and breadth of Aristotle's work makes him one of the most important figures in the history of philosophy. This section will explore his contributions across several key areas: logic and the organon, metaphysics, ethics, politics, natural sciences, and rhetoric and poetics. Aristotle's work in logic, particularly his invention of syllogism and formal logic, has had a lasting impact on the development of philosophical reasoning. The Organon, a collection of works on logic, is the cornerstone of his logical contributions. Aristotle developed the syllogism as a form of deductive reasoning, where two premises lead to a necessary conclusion. The syllogism became the basic framework for valid arguments and reasoning, marking a critical advancement in how humans understood logical processes. Prior to Aristotle, logical thinking was rudimentary and lacked a systematic approach. His formalization of logic provided philosophers with the tools to create more structured and precise arguments. Aristotle's method of syllogistic reasoning has had an enduring influence on later philosophers, from the medieval scholastics to modern logicians. In addition to the syllogism, Aristotle's work in the Organon covered topics such as categorization, propositions, and the nature of inference, establishing a system of logic that dominated intellectual thought for centuries. The Organon would influence the development of scientific methodology, ensuring that logical consistency and clarity became fundamental to the study of philosophy and the natural world. Moving beyond logic, Aristotle's metaphysical inquiries provide some of the most profound insights into the nature of reality. At the heart of his metaphysical thought lies the theory of substance, which he defines as that which exists in itself and serves as the foundation of all things. Substance, in Aristotle's view, is the core of reality, and everything in the world is a combination of substances and their properties. For Aristotle, the question of what it means to be, the study of ontology, was central. His famous distinction between potentiality and actuality illuminates his understanding of being. Potentiality refers to the capacity of a thing to become something else, while actuality represents the fulfillment of that potential. This dynamic interplay between potential and actual states of being is crucial to understanding change, motion, and development in the natural world. Everything in nature, according to Aristotle, is in a state of flux, moving from potentiality to actuality, and this process forms the foundation of the natural world. This notion of change and development is seen most clearly in his metaphysical ideas about the unmoved mover, an entity that initiates all motion without itself being moved. The unmoved mover is an essential concept in Aristotle's thought, acting as a necessary first cause, an explanation for motion and change in the universe that does not require an explanation itself. This idea has profound implications for understanding causality and the nature of existence itself. Aristotle's approach to causality is also central to his metaphysical system, as he identifies four types of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. This theory of causality is foundational for both philosophy and science, as it provides a comprehensive framework for explaining how and why things exist and change in the world. Aristotle's work in ethics is equally influential, with his Nicomachean Ethics standing as one of the foundational texts of moral philosophy. Aristotle's ethical theory is often classified as virtue ethics, which emphasizes the development of virtuous character traits over adherence to rules or consequences. The central concept in Aristotle's ethics is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. Eudaimonia is achieved through the cultivation of virtues, which are habits that help individuals live in accordance with reason. Aristotle argues that human beings are naturally inclined to pursue happiness, but happiness is not found in fleeting pleasures or material wealth. Rather, true happiness comes from living a life of virtue and rational activity, aligning one's actions with reason and the common good. Aristotle's doctrine of the mean is another key element of his ethics, wherein he argues that virtue lies in finding a balance between extremes. For example, courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice, and generosity is the mean between prodigality and stinginess. The concept of practical wisdom, phronesis, also plays a crucial role in Aristotle's moral philosophy. Practical wisdom is the ability to make sound judgments about how to act in particular situations, taking into account both moral principles and the specific context. It allows individuals to navigate the complexities of life and make decisions that promote their own flourishing and the well-being of others. In his political philosophy, Aristotle made significant contributions to the understanding of governance, justice, and the role of the state. In politics, he examines the nature of different political systems, including democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, and seeks to determine the best form of government. Aristotle's ideal state is one that promotes the good life for all its citizens, where the rulers are virtuous and act in the common interest. He argues that a balanced political system, such as a polity, a mix of democracy and oligarchy, provides the best opportunity for a flourishing society. Aristotle critiques Plato's ideal state as described in the Republic, arguing that Plato's vision of philosopher kings and rigid social classes is unrealistic and fails to account for the diversity of human experience. Aristotle's views on democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny reflect his deep concern with the practical realities of governance. He notes the dangers of extreme democracy, which can lead to mob rule, and the dangers of oligarchy, which can result in the oppression of the poor. His critique of tyranny, where a single ruler governs for personal gain, is a powerful reminder of the corrupting influence of power. Aristotle's political ideas influenced subsequent political thinkers, from medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas to modern political theorists, and continue to be a touchstone for debates on justice, governance, and the nature of the state. Aristotle's contributions to the natural sciences were groundbreaking, and his empirical approach to the study of biology, zoology, and physics marked a significant departure from the purely abstract philosophical methods of his predecessors. Aristotle believed that knowledge should be grounded in observation and experience, and he spent considerable time studying the natural world. His method of observation and classification in biology was revolutionary. Aristotle meticulously studied a wide variety of plants and animals, classifying them based on their similarities and differences. His work in biology laid the foundation for later developments in taxonomy, and his emphasis on empirical research was a precursor to the scientific method. While his theories in physics have since been superseded by modern science, Aristotle's ideas about the nature of motion, causality, and the structure of the universe had a lasting impact on scientific thought. His work influenced thinkers like Galileo and Newton, who would eventually provide more accurate explanations of physical phenomena. Aristotle's contributions to the philosophy of science were equally important, as he emphasized the need for systematic inquiry and empirical investigation in understanding the natural world. He believed that science should seek to explain the causes of natural phenomena, and his work in physics, biology, and astronomy set the stage for future scientific discoveries. In addition to his work in philosophy and the natural sciences, Aristotle made important contributions to the study of rhetoric and poetics. In rhetoric, Aristotle examines the art of persuasion and its role in society. He defines rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. For Aristotle, rhetoric was not just about manipulation or eloquence. It was about reasoning and convincing others through logical argumentation. He identifies three modes of persuasion: ethos, character; pathos, emotion; and logos, reason. Aristotle's work in rhetoric had a profound influence on the development of communication studies, and his analysis of persuasive techniques remains central to the study of argumentation and public speaking. In poetics, Aristotle defines tragedy as a form of dramatic art that portrays the downfall of a noble character due to a flaw or error in judgment. His concept of catharsis, the emotional purification experienced by the audience during the tragic drama, became a key idea in the study of drama and literature. Aristotle's influence on Western drama is immense, as his ideas on plot structure, character development, and thematic depth continue to shape the way playwrights and filmmakers approach storytelling. In conclusion, Aristotle's contributions to philosophy, science, and the arts are immeasurable. His work in logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, natural sciences, rhetoric, and poetics has shaped the course of Western thought for over 2 millennia. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation, rational analysis, and systematic inquiry laid the groundwork for modern science and philosophy. His moral philosophy, political theory, and ideas about the nature of being continue to be central to contemporary debates in ethics, governance, and metaphysics. Aristotle's intellectual legacy is one of the most enduring in human history, and his ideas continue to influence the way we think about the world, ourselves, and our place in it. In the final years of Aristotle's life, he continued to engage in philosophical inquiry and intellectual activity, leaving a lasting legacy that would influence generations of thinkers. He spent the last years of his life in Athens, overseeing the Lyceum, the school he had founded, and continuing to write and teach. Aristotle's works during this period are critical to understanding his enduring influence on philosophy, science, and the humanities. His contributions were not limited to the early stages of his life but continued to evolve in ways that would shape the intellectual landscape of the centuries that followed. Aristotle's last years were marked by deep intellectual activity, despite the challenges that came with old age. While much of his work had already been completed by the time he reached his later years, his philosophical output continued with key writings that solidified his legacy. These works ranged across multiple fields, from ethics and politics to natural science and metaphysics. One of the significant texts attributed to his later years is on the soul, De Anima, which explores the nature of the soul, its faculties, and its relation to the body. In this work, Aristotle laid out his ideas about life, thought, perception, and cognition. Another notable contribution from his later years includes works on biology and the study of animals. His studies of the natural world continued to be central to his intellectual pursuits, and his observations in biology, particularly regarding the classification of living organisms, would go on to influence later naturalists and biologists. Though Aristotle's writing output in these final years was substantial, it was his systematic approach to philosophy, paired with his empirical methods, that would ensure his ideas persisted well beyond his lifetime. The Lyceum, the school Aristotle had founded, played an integral role in his intellectual development during his final years. It became the center of Aristotelian thought, and Aristotle's teachings were carried forward by his students and followers. The structure of the Lyceum emphasized a scientific approach to philosophy, with an emphasis on empirical observation, logic, and categorization. Under Aristotle's guidance, the school expanded its curriculum to cover a wide range of subjects, from rhetoric and ethics to biology and metaphysics. The Peripatetic school, as it became known, was founded on the principles of Aristotle's thought, and its influence would be felt for centuries. After his death, the Lyceum continued to be an important center of learning, with successive generations of scholars building upon his teachings and expanding on his ideas. Although the school underwent periods of decline and revival, it remained an intellectual beacon for those interested in Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle's ideas were received with a mix of admiration and criticism during his lifetime. While his intellectual reputation was significant, it was not without challenges. Some of his ideas were in direct contrast with the prevailing views of his time, especially those that emerged from Plato's school. Aristotle's critique of Plato's theory of forms, for example, was central to the philosophical debates of the period. Whereas Plato had argued that abstract forms or ideals were the true reality, Aristotle rejected this notion, asserting that reality could be understood through empirical observation and the study of material substances. This difference in approach marked a fundamental divide between the two philosophers, and it also led to criticism from some quarters of the philosophical community. Nevertheless, Aristotle's intellectual rigor and his ability to synthesize knowledge from a variety of fields earned him considerable respect among his peers. His influence in Athens and beyond grew during his life, particularly through the students of the Lyceum. After Aristotle's death in 322 BCE, his ideas continued to be highly regarded and studied, although the reception of his philosophy varied over time. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, there was a shift toward the more philosophical and theological ideas of Plato and other schools of thought. However, the Peripatetic school continued to thrive, and the philosophical tradition that Aristotle had established became entrenched in the intellectual world. Over the centuries, Aristotle's ideas were revisited and adapted by later thinkers, particularly during the Roman era and the Renaissance. His work on logic and reasoning, ethics, and the natural sciences would prove particularly influential in the development of Western thought. The legacy of Aristotle's thought became especially prominent in the Roman world. Roman philosophers such as Cicero, Seneca, and others were greatly influenced by Aristotle's works. Cicero, for example, admired Aristotle's views on ethics and political philosophy, incorporating elements of Aristotle's thought into his own writings on virtue, justice, and governance. In On Duties, De Officiis, Cicero draws heavily on Aristotle's ethical theories, particularly his concept of virtue as a mean between extremes. Cicero also engaged with Aristotle's political philosophy, particularly in his analysis of the best forms of government. While Cicero did not always accept Aristotle's conclusions, he recognized the significance of Aristotle's work in shaping moral and political thought. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher, also engaged deeply with Aristotle's ideas, particularly in ethics. Although Seneca's Stoic philosophy was at times in tension with Aristotle's virtue ethics, he nonetheless respected Aristotle's understanding of human nature and the pursuit of virtue. Seneca's writings on anger, for example, reflect Aristotelian ideas about the emotions and the importance of moderation. Seneca's reflections on the nature of the good life also bear traces of Aristotelian thought, particularly the idea that true happiness comes from living in accordance with nature and reason. In fact, despite differences in their philosophical systems, both Cicero and Seneca found value in Aristotle's insights on human nature, virtue, and the moral life. The influence of Aristotle's ideas did not remain confined to the Romans. His works continued to shape intellectual currents throughout history. During the Middle Ages, Aristotle's philosophy was revived by Christian scholars such as Thomas Aquinas, who sought to reconcile Aristotelian thought with Christian doctrine. Aquinas, in particular, drew heavily on Aristotle's ethical framework, adapting it to fit within the Christian tradition. His work helped preserve Aristotle's ideas through the medieval period and ensured that Aristotle's philosophy would continue to be a major force in the development of Western thought. Aristotle's ideas were also rediscovered during the Renaissance, when humanists and scholars turned to classical texts for guidance in the fields of philosophy, science, and the arts. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Niccolò Machiavelli, and Galileo Galilei engaged with Aristotle's ideas and in some cases challenged them. However, the intellectual environment of the Renaissance was one in which Aristotle's influence was undeniable, and many of his ideas were reinterpreted and refined by thinkers of the period. In the modern era, Aristotle's legacy continued to shape philosophical inquiry. His contributions to logic, ethics, and metaphysics remain foundational in the study of philosophy. His work laid the groundwork for the development of formal logic and had a significant influence on the scientific method, particularly in terms of classification and empirical observation. In ethics, Aristotle's emphasis on virtue and the cultivation of moral character continues to influence contemporary debates on ethics and moral philosophy. The later years of Aristotle's life were marked by continued philosophical activity, with his works in ethics, politics, biology, and metaphysics contributing significantly to his enduring legacy. After his death, his ideas were studied, adapted, and revised by thinkers in the Roman world, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, ensuring that his influence would continue to be felt for centuries. Aristotle's work had a profound impact on the development of Western thought, shaping the course of philosophy, science, and the humanities. His intellectual legacy remains a cornerstone of Western philosophy, and his ideas continue to be a source of inspiration for contemporary thinkers across a wide range of disciplines. Aristotle's philosophy, while revolutionary in its time, did not escape criticism, both during his life and after his death. The intellectual landscape of ancient Greece was marked by a variety of philosophical schools, and Aristotle's ideas were often challenged by his contemporaries as well as later thinkers. In particular, rival philosophical traditions such as the Stoics, Epicureans, and skeptics offered alternative viewpoints that directly contested Aristotle's views on ethics, metaphysics, and the natural world. These schools of thought, while differing in fundamental ways from Aristotle's, played an important role in the evolution of philosophy and the ongoing critique of his work. During his lifetime, Aristotle's views on the nature of reality, ethics, and governance were questioned by philosophers who aligned with other schools. For example, the Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, rejected Aristotle's idea of the soul's immortality and his belief that virtue was a balance between extremes. In contrast to Aristotle's emphasis on achieving happiness through the cultivation of virtue and living in accordance with nature, the Stoics maintained that happiness was found in the mastery over one's own mind and emotions. According to the Stoics, external goods, wealth, and even relationships were ultimately indifferent to the pursuit of happiness. For the Stoics, the wise person lived in accordance with reason, not by seeking material or emotional satisfaction. This philosophical outlook, which emphasized self-control and rationality, contrasted sharply with Aristotle's more human-centered, virtue ethics approach. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, also posed a significant challenge to Aristotle's ethical thought. While Aristotle believed that the ultimate goal of life was to achieve eudaimonia, or flourishing, through the development of virtues, Epicurus argued that pleasure was the ultimate good and that the absence of pain was the most important pursuit. In Aristotle's framework, pleasure could be a part of a well-rounded life, but it was never seen as the highest good in itself. The Epicureans, on the other hand, believed that physical pleasure and the avoidance of suffering were the central motivations for human action. This materialistic worldview, which placed less emphasis on moral virtues and more on immediate sensory experiences, stood in direct contrast to Aristotle's more nuanced ethical system. Aristotle's views on ethics, which involved cultivating moral virtues such as courage, temperance, and wisdom, were often criticized by the Epicureans as overly complex and disconnected from the basic human drive for happiness through pleasure. Skepticism, another rival school, posed a more epistemological challenge to Aristotle's philosophy. Skeptics, such as Pyrrho of Elis, argued that knowledge of the world could never be certain. They questioned the reliability of human perception and reason, emphasizing doubt as a necessary component of philosophical inquiry. In contrast, Aristotle's system of logic, particularly his theory of syllogism, was based on the assumption that human beings could arrive at certain knowledge through rational processes. The skeptics, by denying the possibility of certainty, directly challenged Aristotle's faith in the capacity of human reason to uncover objective truths about the world. The criticisms from these rival schools of thought were significant, but Aristotle's influence on later philosophers was equally profound. After his death, Aristotle's works were scrutinized, interpreted, and adapted by later thinkers, resulting in a complex and evolving legacy. The Renaissance and the Middle Ages saw significant reinterpretations of Aristotle's philosophy, particularly as it became integrated into Christian thought. In the Middle Ages, scholars such as Thomas Aquinas worked to reconcile Aristotle's ideas with the doctrines of Christianity, an endeavor that would have a lasting impact on the development of scholasticism. Aquinas, in particular, sought to harmonize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. He adapted Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover to fit within the Christian understanding of God, arguing that the universe's motion and change could be explained through the existence of a divine first cause. In ethics, Aquinas adopted Aristotle's virtue ethics and the concept of eudaimonia but modified it to align with the Christian notion of divine grace. By incorporating Aristotle's ethical ideas into his own theological system, Aquinas laid the foundation for the scholastic tradition, which would dominate medieval philosophy and continue to influence European thought for centuries. The integration of Aristotle into Christian thought was not without its challenges. Some aspects of his philosophy, particularly his views on the natural world and his emphasis on reason as the highest form of human activity, were seen as potentially incompatible with Christian doctrine. The Church's approval of Aristotle's philosophy, however, led to its widespread acceptance and study, especially in the universities of the Middle Ages. The works of Aristotle became a cornerstone of theological education, and his influence on Christian scholars was profound. His writings on ethics, metaphysics, and natural science were central to the intellectual culture of the period. The legacy of Aristotle also had a significant impact on Islamic philosophers. During the Islamic Golden Age, Aristotle's works were translated into Arabic, and thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes engaged deeply with his ideas. Al-Farabi, known for his work on political philosophy and logic, was deeply influenced by Aristotle's concept of the ideal state and his views on ethics and virtue. He sought to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic teachings, particularly the idea of a rational, organized society governed by reason. Avicenna ibn Sina, one of the most influential philosophers in the Islamic tradition, integrated Aristotelian logic and metaphysics into his own work, particularly in his famous The Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine. Avicenna made significant contributions to the understanding of Aristotle's metaphysics, particularly his theories of being and causality. He sought to refine Aristotle's ideas while also blending them with Neoplatonism and Islamic theology. Avicenna's work on the nature of existence and the relationship between God and the cosmos helped to further the development of Islamic philosophy and ensured that Aristotle's ideas would continue to be studied and developed in the centuries that followed. Averroes ibn Rushd also made significant contributions to the reinterpretation of Aristotle's philosophy. Known for his extensive commentaries on Aristotle's works, Averroes sought to preserve and defend Aristotle's ideas in the face of growing opposition from Islamic theologians. He emphasized the compatibility of reason and faith, arguing that Aristotle's philosophy provided a rational framework for understanding the world that was not incompatible with religious belief. Averroes' work was pivotal in preserving Aristotelian thought during a time when it was under attack from both religious and philosophical critics, and his commentaries on Aristotle became a key source of intellectual activity in both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. In the Renaissance, the revival of classical learning led to a renewed interest in Aristotle's philosophy. Thinkers such as Leonardo da Vinci, Niccolò Machiavelli, and Galileo Galilei engaged with Aristotelian thought, often critiquing and expanding upon his ideas. While Renaissance thinkers were influenced by Aristotle's natural science and his understanding of human nature, they also challenged some of his assumptions, particularly in the fields of astronomy and physics. Galileo, for example, famously disagreed with Aristotle's views on the motion of celestial bodies, contributing to the scientific revolution that would ultimately upend many of Aristotle's theories. Despite the challenges and critiques of Aristotle's philosophy, his legacy remained remarkably resilient. His works were continuously revisited, revised, and reinterpreted by thinkers across cultures and eras, from the Islamic Golden Age to the Renaissance and beyond. The criticisms of Aristotle, especially those raised by rival schools of thought such as the Stoics, Epicureans, and Skeptics, did not diminish his influence but rather contributed to the ongoing evolution of his ideas. Through reinterpretations and adaptations, Aristotle's thought remained central to Western and Islamic intellectual traditions, shaping the trajectory of philosophy, science, and theology for centuries. His intellectual legacy continues to be a foundational element of contemporary philosophical inquiry, underscoring the enduring relevance of his ideas in the modern world. Aristotle's influence on modern philosophy and science is profound and continues to resonate throughout contemporary thought. His contributions to logic, ethics, metaphysics, and natural science laid the groundwork for much of Western intellectual history, influencing subsequent thinkers, scientific methods, and ethical frameworks. Despite the emergence of new philosophical paradigms and scientific advancements, Aristotle's ideas have endured, continually shaping how we think about reason, morality, and the natural world. One of the most enduring aspects of Aristotle's influence is his development of logic. His work in this field, especially his invention of syllogism, formed the foundation for formal logic and reasoning. The system of syllogistic logic, as articulated in his Organon, provided a structured method for deductive reasoning that influenced not only his contemporaries but also generations of thinkers who followed. In modern philosophy, figures such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel engaged deeply with Aristotle's logical framework, often adapting and expanding upon it to fit the needs of their respective philosophical systems. Leibniz, a key figure in the development of early modern logic, was profoundly influenced by Aristotle's formal logic, particularly his focus on clear definitions and categorical thinking. Although Leibniz sought to develop a more advanced system of logic with his development of the calculus of reasoning, his approach was deeply rooted in Aristotelian principles. Leibniz envisioned a universal language of reasoning that would allow for the precise and systematic expression of all human knowledge, building on Aristotle's insistence on clarity and categorization. In this sense, Leibniz's work can be seen as a natural progression of Aristotle's logical method, extending it into a more sophisticated and mathematically grounded form. Immanuel Kant, another pivotal figure in modern philosophy, engaged with Aristotle's ideas in his own unique way. While Kant's transcendental idealism diverged significantly from Aristotle's more empirical and materialistic worldview, Kant's approach to epistemology and metaphysics was indirectly shaped by Aristotle's influence. Kant's understanding of categories and the structure of human knowledge can be traced back to Aristotle's work on categorization and classification. Kant's categorical imperative, a key element of his moral philosophy, shares similarities with Aristotle's virtue ethics, particularly in its emphasis on duty, rationality, and universal principles. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel also grappled with Aristotle's ideas, particularly in his dialectical method. While Hegel's dialectics are fundamentally different from Aristotle's syllogistic logic, both philosophers shared an interest in understanding how opposing ideas or forces can resolve into a higher synthesis. Aristotle's notion of potentiality and actuality, the idea that things exist in a state of becoming and that change is an essential feature of reality, resonated with Hegel's own philosophy of history and the development of ideas. Hegel's view of the unfolding of history as a dialectical process can be seen as a modern reinterpretation of Aristotle's teleological view of nature, in which all things strive toward an ultimate end or purpose. Beyond logic, Aristotle's influence on ethics remains a cornerstone of modern moral philosophy, particularly in the development of virtue ethics. While modern ethics has been shaped by a variety of philosophical traditions, including deontology and utilitarianism, Aristotle's virtue ethics has experienced a resurgence in recent decades, largely due to the work of contemporary philosophers such as Alasdair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot, and Martha Nussbaum. Aristotle's ethical theory, which emphasizes the cultivation of virtues such as courage, temperance, and wisdom, as the path to eudaimonia, human flourishing, has proven to be highly relevant in addressing contemporary moral challenges. Alasdair MacIntyre's work, particularly his book After Virtue, is a key example of Aristotle's continuing influence on modern ethics. MacIntyre critiques modern ethical theory, which he argues has lost its sense of moral purpose and is fragmented by individualistic and relativistic approaches to morality. Instead, MacIntyre calls for a return to a more Aristotelian virtue ethics, one that emphasizes community, tradition, and the development of moral character. By reintroducing Aristotle's notion of flourishing and the importance of cultivating virtues within a social context, MacIntyre seeks to restore a sense of moral coherence in the modern world. Similarly, Philippa Foot and Martha Nussbaum have worked to adapt Aristotle's virtue ethics to modern moral philosophy, highlighting its relevance to contemporary debates about justice, human well-being, and the nature of a good life. Foot's work on practical ethics and moral philosophy, for example, stresses the importance of developing virtues that are essential for leading a fulfilling and meaningful life. Nussbaum's capability approach, which focuses on what individuals are able to do and be, builds on Aristotle's ideas of human flourishing and the cultivation of virtues as central to achieving a good life. In both cases, Aristotle's ethical framework provides a rich foundation for addressing contemporary issues in moral theory and human development. In the realm of politics, Aristotle's influence on modern political theory continues to be significant. His Politics offers a detailed analysis of various forms of governance, including democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, and discusses the role of citizens in a well-functioning society. While many aspects of Aristotle's political philosophy are no longer directly applicable to contemporary political systems, his work on the nature of citizenship, the importance of virtue in political life, and the role of the state in promoting the common good remain highly relevant. Political philosophers such as John Rawls and Michael Sandel have drawn on Aristotle's ideas about the importance of virtue and the common good in their own work, contributing to the ongoing relevance of Aristotelian political thought. Aristotle's influence also extends to the realm of science, particularly in the development of the scientific method and the study of biology. Aristotle's empirical approach to the study of the natural world, particularly his observations of animals and plants, laid the groundwork for later developments in biology. His classification system, which categorized organisms based on their characteristics and behaviors, was one of the earliest attempts to systematically understand the diversity of life. While many of Aristotle's scientific theories have been superseded by modern advances in biology and evolutionary theory, his emphasis on observation, classification, and the study of the natural world paved the way for future scientific inquiry. In particular, Aristotle's focus on causality and the four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, continues to have an impact on the philosophy of science. While modern scientists no longer use the concept of final causes in the same way Aristotle did, his ideas about causality and the nature of scientific explanation remain foundational to the philosophy of science. Contemporary philosophers of science such as Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn have engaged with Aristotle's ideas about scientific progress, causal explanation, and the nature of scientific inquiry, demonstrating the lasting significance of his contributions to the development of the scientific method. Furthermore, Aristotle's influence on contemporary biology is significant, particularly in the areas of taxonomy and evolutionary theory. His classification system was a precursor to modern systems of biological classification, and his observations on the behavior and physiology of animals provided a foundation for the development of zoology. Modern biologists, while rejecting many of Aristotle's specific theories, still build upon his basic principles of observation and categorization in their work. Aristotle's focus on the interconnectedness of life forms and his efforts to understand the natural world through direct observation laid the groundwork for the study of biology as a systematic science. In conclusion, Aristotle's influence on modern philosophy and science is vast and enduring. His contributions to logic, ethics, political theory, and the natural sciences continue to shape contemporary thought, providing a foundational framework for understanding reason, morality, and the natural world. Modern philosophers such as Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel have drawn upon Aristotle's ideas, adapting them to fit their own philosophical systems. His ethical theory, particularly virtue ethics, has experienced a resurgence in contemporary moral philosophy, and his influence on the development of the scientific method and the study of biology remains central to the advancement of scientific inquiry. Aristotle's ideas continue to be a vital part of the intellectual landscape, demonstrating the lasting power and relevance of his thought in the modern world. Aristotle stands as one of the towering figures in the history of Western philosophy, and his contributions have shaped not only the development of philosophy itself but also the evolution of numerous academic disciplines. His ideas have resonated across centuries, influencing fields such as logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, and natural sciences. The intellectual legacy he left behind is vast, profound, and continues to guide contemporary thought, establishing him as one of the most influential thinkers of all time. In logic, Aristotle is often regarded as the father of formal logic. His development of syllogism and his systematization of deductive reasoning laid the foundation for centuries of logical inquiry. The Organon, a collection of Aristotle's writings on logic, was central to the formation of formal logic as we understand it today. His method of syllogism, which involves drawing conclusions from two premises, provided a model for logical argumentation that would influence not only philosophers but also mathematicians, scientists, and theorists for centuries. The significance of his work in logic cannot be overstated, as it established a systematic approach to reasoning that formed the basis of intellectual thought well into the modern era. Aristotle's impact on metaphysics is equally substantial. His exploration of being, substance, and causality laid the groundwork for ontological discussions that continue to reverberate in contemporary philosophy. Aristotle's ideas on potentiality and actuality, his famous theory of the four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, and his notion of the unmoved mover provided a framework for understanding change, existence, and the fundamental nature of reality. These concepts were not only foundational for later philosophical inquiry but also influenced the development of Christian theology, particularly in the work of thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, who integrated Aristotelian metaphysics into his theological framework. Even in modern philosophy, Aristotle's metaphysical inquiries continue to inform discussions on existence, causality, and the nature of being. Ethics, perhaps one of Aristotle's most enduring contributions, has been revived and adapted numerous times throughout history, with contemporary philosophers revisiting his work in virtue ethics. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argued that the goal of human life is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or well-being, which is achieved through the cultivation of virtues. His emphasis on the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes of excess and deficiency, offers a practical and holistic approach to ethical decision-making. Unlike deontological or consequentialist ethics, Aristotle's virtue ethics is rooted in the character of the individual and the importance of practical wisdom, phronesis, in guiding moral behavior. Today, virtue ethics has experienced a resurgence in the work of philosophers such as Alasdair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot, and Martha Nussbaum, who have drawn on Aristotle's framework to address contemporary moral issues. Aristotle's influence on political philosophy is another cornerstone of his intellectual legacy. His Politics offers a comprehensive analysis of various forms of government, including democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. Aristotle's view that the best political system is one that balances the rule of law with the cultivation of virtue in citizens remains influential. His ideas on the nature of citizenship, justice, and the common good have shaped not only ancient political thought but also modern theories of democracy and republicanism. While Aristotle's critique of democracy, as seen in his distinction between true and perverted forms of government, has been contested by later thinkers, his focus on the relationship between politics and ethics continues to be a crucial aspect of political theory. In the natural sciences, Aristotle's empirical approach to studying the natural world, particularly in biology, laid the groundwork for later scientific inquiry. His method of observation and classification in biology, especially his work on the anatomy and behavior of animals, was one of the earliest systematic attempts to understand the diversity of life. Although many of Aristotle's scientific theories have been superseded by modern advances, his emphasis on observation, empirical evidence, and systematic classification remains fundamental to the scientific method. Aristotle's influence on the development of biology and the study of nature cannot be underestimated, as his approach to categorizing and understanding organisms paved the way for future scientific exploration. The synthesis of Aristotle's ideas in modern contexts has been a key factor in his enduring legacy. His ideas have not remained static, rather they have been continuously reinterpreted and integrated into new philosophical, scientific, and ethical frameworks. For example, Aristotle's logical system laid the groundwork for the development of modern formal logic, which, through thinkers like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Kurt Gödel, evolved into mathematical logic and the theory of computation. Similarly, his contributions to ethics and politics have been integrated into contemporary debates about morality, justice, and governance. The return to Aristotle's virtue ethics in modern philosophy demonstrates how his ideas can be applied to address contemporary issues such as human flourishing, social justice, and ethical responsibility. In the sciences, Aristotle's empirical methods were instrumental in shaping the scientific revolution, even though many of his specific theories were replaced by more accurate models. His work influenced the natural philosophers of the Renaissance, who looked back to Aristotle's writings on physics, biology, and the classification of species as a foundation for their own work. The transition from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian mechanics marked a shift in the scientific worldview, but Aristotle's emphasis on observation, classification, and empirical inquiry laid the groundwork for the methods employed by later scientists. Reflection on Aristotle's status as one of the most influential thinkers in the history of philosophy brings to light the profound impact he has had across the ages. His work set the stage for the intellectual developments that followed, from the philosophy of the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment and beyond. The fact that his ideas have persisted and evolved over 2 millennia speaks to the depth and universality of his thinking. Aristotle's synthesis of reason and observation, his commitment to understanding the natural world, and his exploration of human flourishing remain vital parts of philosophical discourse today. As we consider Aristotle's legacy, it is evident that he was not merely a philosopher confined to his time but a thinker whose ideas have had a lasting and transformative impact on the way we approach knowledge, ethics, politics, and science. His intellectual contributions were not isolated in their time but have continued to shape the trajectory of Western thought. Aristotle's ideas are not just historical artifacts, they remain relevant in our understanding of the world and our place in it. His legacy endures because his philosophy offers a comprehensive, integrated view of the world, a vision that invites us to seek knowledge, cultivate virtue, and strive for the flourishing of both individuals and societies. In that sense, Aristotle's philosophy is not just a relic of the past, but a living tradition that continues to inform and enrich our understanding of the world today.